The city has become a prime military target for Russia, which has already deployed more than 50,000 troops in the surrounding area, seeking to exploit its numerical superiority to wear down Ukrainian forces. The Russians are less than 20 kilometers from the outskirts of Sumy, and the aim is to open new fronts, forcing the Ukrainian army to fight in several sectors at once. To contain the advance, Ukraine has been deploying highly mobile elite troops, who move quickly to the most critical points of the front line in an attempt to hold their positions, although this has caused enormous physical and psychological strain. In addition to ground combat, Russia has stepped up its airstrikes. On June 28 to 29, 2025, Moscow launched its largest drone and missile strike since the start of the war, with more than 400 Iranian Shahid drones and dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles, such as the Quinzel and Iskander. Although Ukraine managed to intercept about 70% of these threats, the rest caused massive destruction, with civilian targets severely damaged, including residential buildings and essential infrastructure. Russia's strategy is clear: to wear down not only the Ukrainian army, but also the morale of the population, increasing terror and social collapse. The video also highlights a critical factor that is further aggravating the Ukrainian situation: the growing distance from the United States under the Trump administration. Since taking office, the American president has not approved any significant new arms packages for Ukraine, and even the funds approved by the previous administration have been delivered slowly. This stance puts Kyiv in an extremely delicate situation, since much of its defense depends directly on American military support. The lack of new weapons, especially advanced anti-aircraft systems such as Patriot missiles, leaves Ukrainian cities even more vulnerable to Russian attacks. The video explains that Ukraine is also facing problems with its defensive fortifications, such as poorly constructed trenches that are vulnerable to Russian drones, which has further exposed troops on the front line. Despite all the pressure, Ukrainian forces continue to resist bravely, relying on elite units to try to maintain control of the terrain. However, the cost of this resistance, both human and material, is growing rapidly every day. Ukrainian commander Alexander Syrsky says that, so far, the troops have managed to stop the Russian advance towards Sumy, but the pressure is only increasing. Russia continues to reinforce its forces and increase airstrikes, while support from the United States remains uncertain. The United States is in a position to supply crucial weapons such as Patriot missiles. Without these systems, Ukrainian cities are increasingly exposed, while Russia continues its combined ground and air offensive, using air terrorism as a psychological and military weapon to destabilize the country and force surrender on several fronts, including the city of Sumy, which could be the next major chapter in this brutal war. While Sumy holds out with all its might, an even greater shadow looms over Ukraine's future: the weakening of international support. The main concern at this point revolves around the United States. Since Donald Trump returned to power, relations between Washington and Kyiv have changed dramatically. Almost 6 months into his term, Trump has not approved any major arms packages for Ukraine. The few packages that are still arriving on Ukrainian soil were authorized by the previous administration and are being released slowly, in small quantities, as if they were rationed. This change in stance leaves the Ukrainian government in an increasingly vulnerable position, just as Moscow is stepping up its offensive with full force. With each passing day, the stockpile of ammunition and sophisticated weapons is dwindling, and Ukraine is desperately dependent on new shipments of weapons, especially air defense systems and long-range ammunition. Trump, focused on domestic issues and a foreign policy that prioritizes direct negotiations with adversaries, has made it clear that he does not intend to maintain the same level of military involvement as the previous administration. Although he has expressed frustration with Moscow's lack of a ceasefire agreement, the American president has not taken any practical steps to strengthen the Ukrainian army. For many analysts, Trump's inaction on the Ukrainian issue amounts, in practice, to a strategic gift to Vladimir Putin. The lack of military aid from the United States has a direct impact on daily battles. Without American weapons, Ukraine fights with less ammunition, fewer anti-aircraft systems, and a limited number of armored vehicles. This not only reduces the ability to respond immediately on the battlefield, but also compromises the ability to replace losses. At the same time, the Russians continue to reinforce their troops and expand their weapons production. With the support of allies such as Iran, which supplies drones on a large scale. In recent weeks, Ukrainian troops have also begun to report another critical problem: the poor condition of their defensive fortifications. In several regions, including strategic points such as KSK, soldiers have been forced to withdraw from positions that had serious structural flaws. Many trenches were poorly constructed, with little protection against airstrikes and no adequate camouflage. These deficiencies have taken their toll on the battlefield. Russian drones, equipped with thermal cameras and guided munitions, can easily locate and target these vulnerable positions, causing heavy casualties and opening gaps in Ukrainian defenses. Those soldiers who survive are faced with the dilemma of having to build new fortifications under constant enemy fire, in a never-ending cycle of destruction and reconstruction. Despite all these adversities, Ukrainian resistance remains steadfast. Elite special forces continue to be the backbone of defensive operations, acting as a rapid intervention force in threatened sectors. Whenever the Russians open a new front, these troops are urgently sent in to try to stabilize the defense line and, where possible, regain lost ground. However, with each mission, the human and material strain becomes more severe. The number of wounded increases, morale is constantly tested, and the shortage of weapons makes each operation even more risky. According to Commander Alexander Sursky, Sumy remains a symbol of resistance, but Russian pressure is increasing every day. The combination of Moscow's numerical superiority, massive airstrikes, and the lack of consistent military support from the United States creates an extremely dangerous scenario. Despite all these challenges, Ukraine still finds some support on the international stage. European countries have been sending weapons and equipment, trying to fill the gaps left by the Americans. In addition, Israel recently announced the sending of long-range air defense systems, in an attempt to protect at least part of Ukrainian cities from constant bombardment. However, certain highly capable weapons, such as the Patriot anti-aircraft missiles, are still exclusive to the United States. Without these weapons, Ukraine's defenses remain incomplete. Cities continue to be exposed to Russian aerial terrorism, with ballistic missiles and drones attacking vital infrastructure and civilian targets. This scenario makes the task of defending Sumy and other strategic regions increasingly complex and dangerous. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Russia continues to pursue its strategy of exhaustion. The Kremlin is betting all its chips on a combination of air power, coordinated ground strikes, and an international blockade of aid to Ukraine. With each passing day without new weapons arriving, Ukraine sees its military position weaken. If Sumy falls, it may not be just another city lost. It could be the beginning of a new phase in the war, marked by an even more aggressive Russian offensive capable of breaking through the country's last lines of defense. The situation is critical, and the big question remains: how long can Ukraine hold out without sufficient external support? And if Sumy falls, who will be the next target? These answers could determine not only the fate of the war, but also the future of Europe as a whole. As the battle for Sumy intensifies, so does concern about the speed with which Russia is adapting its tactics and expanding its military capabilities. It's not just about numbers. The Kremlin has been honing its electronic warfare operations, jamming Ukrainian communications, blocking GPS signals, and making it harder for defense forces to coordinate. Drone attacks, once limited to one-offs, are now being carried out in large swarms, with hundreds of drones flying in different directions at once, confusing air defense systems and overwhelming interception capabilities. With each passing week, Russia appears to be getting more effective in its combined offensives, where air strikes, artillery bombardments, and ground advances are being synchronized. On the other hand, Ukraine, while resilient, is facing increasingly obvious limitations. Shortages of ammunition, especially heavy artillery, have forced Ukrainian commanders to ration the use of their most powerful weapons. Long-range missile and rocket fire, which was once frequent, is now reserved only for very high-priority targets. On the most exposed fronts, many soldiers report that they no longer have enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged bombardment. On several occasions, Ukrainian troops have been forced to retreat to avoid being surrounded, giving up strategic positions simply for lack of resources. The situation in the medical field is also alarming. Military hospitals near the front lines are operating beyond capacity, with little equipment and medicine to treat the wounded. Many seriously injured soldiers have to wait hours or even days to be transported to more structured medical facilities. This has a direct impact on the morale of the troops, who know that if they are injured, their chances of survival are reduced. Nevertheless, the spirit of resistance continues. The civilian population of Sumy has shown great courage, organizing support networks for the soldiers, providing shelter and food for those defending the city. However, this solidarity is not enough to balance the growing military imbalance. In Ukraine's domestic political scene, pressure is growing on Volodymyr Zelensky's government. Regional leaders and parliamentarians have been demanding stronger responses and urgent measures to strengthen the country's defenses. Zelensky, in turn, has been insisting on international appeals, asking Western countries to speed up the shipment of weapons and impose new sanctions on Russia. However, the pace of international negotiations has not kept pace with the speed of Russian attacks. While diplomatic meetings drag on, missiles continue to fall on Ukrainian cities. Russia, for its part, is banking on this delay. The Kremlin's strategy is to wear down not only the Ukrainian army, but also the patience of the West. Moscow knows that the longer the war goes on, the greater the political fatigue will be in European countries and the United States, which are facing domestic pressure to reduce spending on the war. At the same time, the Russian propaganda machine remains active, both at home and abroad, trying to present the offensive as an inevitable and legitimate move to protect its strategic interests. Another factor that has weighed heavily on recent battles is Russia's intensive use of mercenaries and paramilitary forces. Reports indicate that groups such as the Imperial Legion and other private contingents have been sent to the most violent combat fronts, assuming shock roles and carrying out infiltration attacks. These forces, less concerned with the laws of war, have carried out massacres and cleansing operations in villages that resist Russian occupation. Ukraine, even knowing the risks, is forced to face them with what it has available, often at a numerical disadvantage and with inferior equipment. While the front line still remains around Sumy, there are fears that if the city falls, other regions could follow suit in a domino effect. Cities such as Chernihiv and Poltava are already on high alert, with reinforcements being rushed in and preparations being made for possible mass evacuations. With each passing day, the war moves deeper into the heart of Ukraine, and the specter of total military collapse begins to loom on the horizon. Amid all this, the main dilemma remains the same. Ukraine is fighting not just against Russia, but against time. Every day without sufficient military support is a strategic victory for Moscow. Every delay in arms deliveries is a new sector that could collapse. Every hesitation in the West could cost the fall of an entire city. The Battle of Sumy, therefore, is much more than a dispute over territory. It symbolizes the desperate struggle of an entire country to survive in the face of a war machine that shows no signs of slowing down. War is not just about tanks and soldiers. It is also about political decisions, about fear, and about fatigue. The big question now is, will the West act before it is too late? Or will Sumy be just the first of many cities to fall in this brutal new phase of the conflict?